English 112 students. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking specifically about William Shakespeare's lifetime. I think it helps us interpret his plays and his poetry, if you were to read that too, knowing about the context in which he was living and writing. We talked a little bit last week about the larger context, about England under the Tudors, under Elizabeth, the way England was changing because of the Renaissance and the Reformation. So now I want to look at Shakespeare specifically in terms of his own life and context. His father, John Shakespeare, is part of what is beginning to emerge as a middle class. Before the Renaissance and the Reformation, the class structure in England and much of Europe was basically two classes. You either owned a lot of land and were rich and were considered nobility, or you weren't. And you were born into whichever class you were born into, and then you probably died in that same class. There are some exceptions. Geoffrey Chaucer is an exception of a person who kind of moved up the social ladder. But during the Renaissance and the Reformation, so when Shakespeare's family is beginning to kind of coalesce, there is this growing business class, business owners. And so there's this emerging middle class. His father, John, is part of that class. His mother, Mary, is from a very well-to-do land-owning family. In fact, in Warwickshire County, where they lived and William Shakespeare was born, it's the red county on this map, there is still an area known as Arden Forest, and that's land that Mary Arden's family owned. So Shakespeare himself comes from this interesting mix of upper class and middle class, this brand new middle class. And William Shakespeare is able to take advantage of the changes that have come to England because of the Renaissance and the Reformation. The year that he is born, in 1564, is a plague year. So the Black Plague happened over the course of many years in Europe and England. And periodically it would sweep through, and then it would go away for a while, and then it would come back again. So Shakespeare was born in a plague year, and his small town, Stratford-upon-Avon, was hit pretty significantly. So the fact that even that he survived past childhood is pretty impressive. So we know for sure that Shakespeare's father was a business owner. We know that his primary business was as a glove maker, but we also have records of him as a moneylender and then having some farm holdings as well. William Shakespeare, his son, is able to take advantage of the free education that's available now to all boys. It's not really available to girls quite yet. But this is one of those big changes in England, thanks to the Renaissance and the Reformation, is this broadening of free education. So we know what his education would have looked like. His early education would have been much more than what we consider elementary school. He would have been very well educated in both Latin and Greek. He would have memorized and recited in the Latin and in the Greek a lot of classical literature and classical mythology. So it's not surprising when a lot of that shows up in his writing. We know that in 1577, his father got into some trouble. There isn't exactly a reason why. Some of it may have to do with being involved with illegal wool. Wool at the time, and even still now, is one of England and the United Kingdom now, one of their best exports. Because if you think about the climate, it's often very cool and very damp. And so sheep in that climate grow very thick wool. And so the export of wool to make fabrics, especially to make these large tapestries that would hang on the walls of buildings and of castles and that sort of thing, that was what was making England pretty wealthy at the time. So in order to be a wool dealer, you had to have a license. Shakespeare's father did not have a license, so there is some speculation that maybe he was involved with illegal wool dealing. There's also some speculation that he was Catholic. At the time, remember, England is flipping back and forth a lot between Catholicism and Protestantism, and it's dangerous. People can die. So remember Bloody Mary, Mary the First. She was Catholic. She hunted down Protestants and burned them at the stake. So there's a lot of emphasis on religion. By this point, Elizabeth the First is on the throne, and she is very Protestant. She has a very uneasy relationship with Catholics, but she isn't hunting them down and killing them. But if you did not attend services at a Church of England church, you were fined. And so many Catholics would not attend those services because they didn't recognize that church as a valid church. And so they would be fined for not attending church. And so perhaps John Shakespeare's downfall has to do with being Catholic. But we know in 1577 he was no longer a wealthy business person and he was no longer lending money to people. 2 years later, we know that William Shakespeare leaves school at the age of 15. He does not show up on the school rosters after that. And for 3 years, there's really no documentation of where he was, although there's some pretty good speculation about him teaching and traveling as a tutor. We do know in 1582 that he got married. That is in the church records in Stratford-upon-Avon. He married a woman named Anne Hathaway, not the actress. And she was pregnant at the time they got married, not unusual during this time period, also not unusual now. They had 3 children very quickly. She was pregnant when they got married with their daughter Susanna. And then pretty quickly after that, they had twins, a boy named Hamlet and a girl named Judith. And all of this happens in the first 3 years of their marriage. So before William is 21, he has 3 children and is married. After the twins are born in 1585, William sort of disappears again from the records. He's probably just working and trying to support his family. But he does show up in 1592 in the London theater scene. And he first shows up as an actor. He goes to London apparently to act, and he does show up on some of the playbills and in some of the character lists of plays that were being done during that time. His family does not go with him, though. His family stays in Stratford, up in Warwickshire County, and his only son, Hamnet, dies in 1596. So he's 10 or 11 years old when he dies. And there's some interesting shifts that kind of happen at this point in William Shakespeare's writing and in his life. After about 1599 on, pretty much all he writes are tragedies. So perhaps Hamnet's death in 1596 has to do with that. We do know that Shakespeare was doing really, really well in the London theater scene because there are documents of him purchasing many lands back home in Stratford. So he owned a lot of the different properties in his hometown, so it's pretty evident he was doing pretty well in the London theater scene. Remember, Elizabeth I, the Queen, loved theater. So theater was a really good way to kind of work your way up in society. And William Shakespeare is clearly taking advantage of that. So we know that by 1594, he is a lead actor with a group called Lord Chamberlain's Men. Remember, these groups of actors were not being paid kind of professionally. Instead, they were being paid by a patron. So some wealthy aristocrat, like Lord Chamberlain, who would sponsor these theater groups. So he's part of Lord Chamberlain's Men. This same group later becomes known as the King's Men, once King James takes over after Elizabeth. He was, by all measures, pretty popular. He was a lead actor. He is mentioned in a lot of the different plays being performed. And by 1599, he is a major stakeholder in his acting company. So the income that they're making, not from Lord Chamberlain, but from ticket sales, he is profiting a great deal from that. And so because of this power and because of this wealth, he has his company build this brand new theater building called the Globe. There is a rebuilt version of it in England today that still performs Shakespeare plays. It's not on the exact site that the original Globe was on, but it's pretty close. The original Globe burned down during a performance of a play. So this is the Globe Theater. I think I mentioned it last week. It is built like a donut and a very simple stage, but there is a balcony on the stage. You can have different levels of actors. The stage is elevated, so you can have actors under the stage come up through trapdoors or go down through trapdoors. So there are some nifty little techniques that can be used to put on plays, but the stage itself is rather plain. And so that's why many of Shakespeare's characters have to do a lot of explanation about, like, it's the time of day or what kind of weather we're having. They have to mention those things because there's no real way to tell what's happening because the stage is rather simple. So Shakespeare as a writer was pretty prolific. He wrote 38 plays, 154 sonnets, and 2 longer narrative poems, so poems that tell a story. There are a few smaller poems as well, but we're not positive those are Shakespeare's because they're not signed. These various plays and sonnets and poems have shown up in all kinds of different editions over the years. His plays were not published during his lifetime. Remember, plays during this time are just meant to be performed. They're not being published and sold for people to read like we do today with a lot of plays. However, there were some copies kind of circulating, whether it's a copy that an actor had that gets copied by hand, or maybe someone comes to see the play and they jot down some notes and they recreate it. After Shakespeare's death, 2 of his fellow actors from the Lord Chamberlain's Men, which is now known as the King's Men at this time, they gathered together all of his plays and they published them all together for the first time in 1623. This is still the primary source that we use for all Shakespeare plays. It's known as the First Folio. There are 233 copies of them in the world. 82 of them are in Washington, D.C. at the Folger Library. And I just want to mention here really quickly the authorship question. Some of you may have heard this, but anyway, there is this kind of prevailing sentiment among some that Shakespeare did not write Shakespeare, that it's a pen name and someone else must have written it. There are all kinds of people who have been put forward as possible writers. I have a really hard time with people who don't believe that Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare, mostly because the arguments themselves do not come from his lifetime. The argument about Shakespeare being a real person and being the real writer did not start until around the American Civil War in the 1860s. So over 200 years after his death did people start questioning. And, there's 200 years there where it wasn't questioned. So that's one thing. It's a rather new phenomenon. And there's really no proof that anyone else is Shakespeare. The other thing that bothers me about the argument that Shakespeare did not write Shakespeare is that at the foundation of it, at the bottom of that argument, is just pure classism. It's basically saying this guy named William Shakespeare, who was born in this small town in the middle of nowhere, could not have possibly been smart enough to write these plays. And I think that's offensive. Think about it. Most of us live in a small town in the middle of nowhere. Many of us were born in a small town in the middle of nowhere. And so the assumption that someone born in a small town in the middle of nowhere cannot possibly be intelligent enough to understand their world and understand people well enough to make these plays is, I think, misguided. So that's the authorship question. There it is. I have a fantastic book to recommend on it called Contested Will, if you're interested. So anyway, here's a copy of the First Folio. I took that picture. You can see my reflection in the glass. That's one of the ones on display at the Folger Library in Washington, D.C. I think it's awesome. That book was published in 1623, and there it sits. So cool. Like, seriously, it's almost 400 years old, and there it sits. Anywho, let's move on. So the First Folio divides his plays into 3 categories, and we still use these categories today. The comedies, the histories, and the tragedies. So you can automatically tell what kind a play is just by its title. The comedies are titled with very general titles, never characters' names. So things like Merry Wives of Windsor, Much Ado About Nothing, A Midsummer Night's Dream, those are comedies. Histories always have a name and a number because they're always about a king. Henry IV, Henry V, Richard III, Richard II. Tragedies are titled with a specific character's name. Julius Caesar, Hamlet, Romeo and Juliet, Titus Andronicus, Othello. We know those are tragedies because of their titles. Tragedy is an interesting idea. It doesn't just simply mean sad, although they often are, but it means this larger sense that things fall apart, that the natural cycle of life tends towards chaos. Often the main character is what's known as a tragic hero. It's this character that often begins with some sort of lofty position. They are a prince, they are a princess, something like that. And through some sort of character flaw, some sort of tragic flaw that they have, they put into place this succession of events that leads to their downfall. Aristotle in ancient Greece thought that tragedy was a good thing, that we should go to the theater and watch tragedies. And in fact, there are many tragedies from ancient Greece that we still read and put on today. Aristotle argued that tragedy is catharsis. It's a chance for us to go to the theater and ask some pretty dark questions and experience sadness and anger and these very negative kinds of emotions. And Aristotle thought, well, if we do that at the theater, if we experience those emotions there, then we get them out of our system, catharsis. And then when we go home, we're good people. Now, I'm not sure it's that simple anymore, but I do think tragedy plays an important role in our literature. And if you think about the movies we watch and the television shows we watch, many of them do follow kind of the pattern of tragedy. In Shakespeare's life, most of his tragedies were written towards the end of his life. So after 1599, he pretty much cranked out tragedies pretty quickly from 1599 on. Tragedies follow this pyramid shape that you can see there on the screen. This pyramid shape was created a little bit later. This isn't something that Shakespeare was following. But in literature, we can follow a story, particularly tragedy, and it follows this kind of shape. So Act 1 is the exposition. It's just that early phase where we figure out who's who and what's going on. Then we start Act 2, and it goes up the pyramid where things are rising action. Things start getting heated. Things start getting complicated. Things start falling apart. We reach kind of the climax, sort of that scene where everything comes together. That's typically in Act 3. Act 4 is the falling action where we're rapidly seeing the hero's decline or the hero's downfall. And then the play ends, Act 5, with the denouement, if we pronounce it in French, where the play wraps up. Nothing really gets tied up in a pretty little bow like it does in comedies. It just simply ends. And often many people are dead. That's the case in Hamlet. So we know that Hamlet was written between 1600 and 1601. It is an old legend or an old story from Denmark. And in fact, it's set in Denmark. It's not set in England. Hamlet is a Dane. He's Danish. So Shakespeare took this old story and he sort of reinvented it. He does that with most of his plays, actually. He takes old stories and reinvents them. Hamlet, as I've mentioned before in the intro video here, it's a very complex psychological play looking at our motivations for action, for inaction. Who are we? Why does it matter? There's also a really interesting question about succession to a throne. Queen Elizabeth is towards the end of her life when Shakespeare is writing Hamlet. She dies in 1603, and Hamlet is being written in 1600, 1601. She didn't have any kids, and so all of England is wondering what's going to happen when she dies. When her father, Henry VIII, died, it was chaos. So are we going to have that same chaos? So that question of who gets the throne is at the heart of Hamlet. When the play begins, his father, the king, old King Hamlet, is dead. And his uncle, Claudius, his father's brother, has taken the throne and married his mom. And so Hamlet is stuck in this really interesting place of who to call father, first of all, but then also this family structure and this royal structure. So who gets the throne after a king or a queen dies? That was a question on Shakespeare's mind. So let's look at the characters. So here are all the main characters in Hamlet and kind of how to keep track of them. So we're dealing basically with two countries, mostly Denmark, but there is some interesting stuff with Norway. So let me see if I can get my little arrow to show up here. There we go. So over here in Norway, we have the old king named Fortinbras, who is dead, and then his son known as young Fortinbras. Same thing's true in Denmark. We have old King Hamlet and then his son Hamlet. So here's Hamlet, his mom and his dad. When the play begins, old King Hamlet is dead, so his mom is quickly, very quickly, remarried to Claudius. Claudius is the old King Hamlet's brother. This was not unusual, really, at the time. In fact, Henry VIII married his brother's widow after his brother died. Another key character in sort of this older generation is a man named Polonius. He is a counsel. He is a counselor to the king. He used to be a counselor to old King Hamlet, but now that he's dead, he is a kind of a friend and confidant and counselor for Claudius, who is now king. Polonius has two kids, Laertes and Ophelia. Hamlet and Ophelia have a thing going on. That kind of complicates things, just so you know. And then Hamlet's best friend forever, his BFF Horatio, is visiting home with him. They are college buddies. They are in college in Germany at Wittenberg, which is the college where the Reformation began, right? So where Martin Luther was, where he taught. So there's an interesting connection there to the Reformation. Notice this is a generational play. We've got this older generation, and then we've got their kids as the second generation. And it's interesting to see how the two generations interact with each other, but also how the decisions of this generation kind of fall upon the second generation. That idea that the sins of the father will fall upon the son. It's an interesting one, particularly here for Hamlet. So keep in mind this structure. If you kind of forget who's who, come back to this. You can kind of remember all the different connections and who's who. The only characters on here that are not on here that we're going to talk a little bit in depth about are these two guys named Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. They are Hamlet's age, so they're of this generation. They are part of the court. They've grown up with Hamlet. They're part of the nobility. So Hamlet and Ophelia and Laertes, all of these folks have all grown up together, and so have Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. So just keep those two in mind. They're friends of Hamlet's. They grew up with him. So really quickly, I know Shakespeare can be difficult to read. On the one hand, keep in mind that you have the access to listen to the audio. As you're reading it, please do that. It does make it a heck of a lot easier, and it's really entertaining. Just a real quick history, by the way, of the English language. English is not just one language. It's actually a mixture of all kinds of different languages that sort of crashed into each other on this island that we now call England. So in about 500 AD, the Roman Empire is falling. It's crumbling. So the Romans who had been living in England and controlling it leave. They go back to Rome. And so it sort of leaves a power vacuum. It sort of leaves England wide open. And so these three groups from Germany, the Jutes, the Angles, and the Saxons, sail over and take over England since the Romans have left. The Angles and the Saxons become the dominant group, and that's where we get the term Anglo-Saxon to talk about this period. The Anglo-Saxons are very, very early English, and they're the language that they end up developing, which is this sort of Germanic kind of language, is known as Old English. And it's made up of a blend of 4 different Anglo-Saxon dialects. Middle English emerges after the French invade in 1066, and some of those German complexities in the language begin to disappear, and we start to see more French and Latin influence. And then finally, we get into modern English during the time of Shakespeare's life. So Shakespeare's world is known as early modern English. This is the same English of the King James Version of the Bible as well. The language had experienced a lot of change, and at the time it was changing very, very quickly. So there were not a lot of rules. There actually were no spelling rules. You kind of just spelled things as they sounded to you. And then there weren't a lot of grammar rules either. English is primarily a subject, verb, object, so SVO kind of language. So say something like, I ate the sandwich. That's subject, verb, object. But we can play with that. We don't have to put it in that order. And so Shakespeare doesn't always use that order. He flips things around sometimes. So I could say, I ate the sandwich, but if I want to sound really dramatic, I could come busting through the door and say something like, the sandwich ate I. I could completely flip it around. It would still mean the same thing. It would still mean I ate the sandwich, but by flipping it around, I've made it sound different. I've made the rhythm of the sentence feel different, and I've made you think about it in a different way. So that's why Shakespeare is often flipping things around and writing sentences in ways that we probably wouldn't today. All right. This week, Act 1 of Hamlet. That's going to be below, and I look forward to seeing your answers to the discussion questions.